Okay, Jimmy, over to you.
Comrades, first of all, I'd like to thank you, the comrades, for the entertainment. Um, it was interesting to say the least, but I couldn't understand the word. Um, Comrades, today we are privileged again to have a very prominent hero of the Canadian working class movement, Comrade John Clark. John is most known by reputation for the work he did with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty for so many years, I think about 25 years or so. He was the prominent face of that organisation. Um, we, we generally have the viewpoint that Canada is a land with massive resources, a lot of them yet to be developed, well, a land with major cities um, and large sections of industrialized populations. Yet it doesn't seem to be a happy place in some senses because due to the recent development of the vicious tariffs perpetuated by people that Trump particularly takes a dislike to, Canada has been at the receiving end of those. The general understanding would be that the first attempt would be made or the initial justification would be the United States capitalists wishing to gain more control, more return, and more exploitation of not just Canada, but generally anywhere in the world that fancies. But Canada has the disadvantage of being a handy neighbour and a very dependent neighbour in the sense that a lot of the trade of Canada is dependent on the United States. The profiteers in Canada are obviously suffering, and through their control of the legislative system, it's very handy for them to try and protect those profits by introducing taxes, charges, and penalties against the working class, cuts against the education, social system, etc. We also have the memory that not so long ago we had massive protests, blockades um, by a section of the ruling class, the industrial class, interlinked with right-wing activists who blockaded the cities and streets to get sectional demands for themselves. Interestingly enough, here in Ireland, not so long ago, we had imitations of that with massive blockades of the owners of heavy machinery and smaller industries, large farmers, etc., and also penetrated to a lesser degree, but still penetrated by the far right. Um, John, I hope, is going to give us an update on the situation of the problems facing Canadian workers and of the state of the trade unions, the state of the labour movement, which appears to be in recession, despite the potential aggression developing against the class. So, John, it's over to you, and you have the stage for the next 20, 25 minutes or so. And it's all yours.
Thanks a lot, Jimmy. Thank you, comrades. I'm going to I'm going to say that I think that the situation in Canada is probably quite interesting from an international perspective. You may remember that a little while ago, the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, he made this presentation at the World Economic Forum at Davos, in which he talked about the end of the world order. He wasn't entirely wrong on that, but he talked about a strategy for middle powers, as he put it, to deal with the end of the world order and all the implications that flew from that. And I think that Carney was trying to articulate the position of one of a number of what I might call junior partner imperialist powers that exist in the world that have accepted US domination, but taken their place and taken their cut within a world system. And so Carney was articulating that. And I think what he was putting forward was interesting because the situation in Canada is I think, a rather intense version of what other comparable countries are facing, be that the UK, be that many of the European countries, etc., dealing with a situation where the America First turn is having enormous implications. So here, I mean, I would say that the America First turn constitutes a reaction by a section of the US ruling establishment to the obvious reality that American power is weakening relative to major competitors, and it doesn't wish to continue to play, or isn't able to play, the same kind of role of world leadership. Not that it doesn't want to remain dominant, but it's not in a position to underwrite a world system in the way that it was in the years following the Second World War. And the Biden attempt to maintain that didn't work well, and now Trump's back, and he's not saying he's doing well either, but he's pursuing a strategy that is based on a pragmatic pursuit of immediate gain, a kind of a global extortion racket that US imperialism has turned to. It involves, of course, brutal deployment of military power, but it also involves a return to protectionism. And that's really the issue that's before us at the moment. A major turn to protectionism, and that, I think, creates. And Carney was articulating that. He was reflecting the fact that for Canadian capitalism and the Canadian capitalist class, the attempt by the US to impose much harsher terms on the trading relationship it's of enormous significance to the Canadian ruling class. In fact, you might even say it's an existential crisis, because Canada, it has a particularly intense economic relationship with the United States. Some 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. The country is economically integrated to the United States to a remarkable degree. Since the Auto Pact for car manufacturing was signed in 1965, we've had a series of trade agreements that have integrated the economy to an amazing degree. If a car comes off an assembly line in Canada, as that was built, the component parts have crossed the border numerous times to be worked on in each country. So an amazing level of integration that takes place. And that is, I think, something that's really, really has created for the Canadian capitalist class a situation of enormous danger. And they're looking to develop a strategy to respond to that situation. And Mark Carney has played quite a remarkable role in this regard. Carney, of course, people in the UK will be familiar with him, of course, from his period as governor of the Bank of England. He was also governor of the Bank of Canada, but governor of the Bank of England, and he was there at the time of Brexit. And he likes to play on that. He likes to talk about the fact that he has experience dealing with crises, and he's a very accomplished, consummate representative of capital. And he took the Liberal Party leadership away from Justin Trudeau on precisely that approach. So he's looking to develop. He's looking to turn the Liberal Party government to the right to an enormous degree, and he's looking to develop a strategy to effectively respond to the crisis that is imposed by the America First turn. He I think represents. I mean, his background is thoroughly a technocratic servant of capital, and he's looking to develop a strategy to respond to the situation. He's made a lot of play about patriotism and standing up to bullies and all this kind of stuff. But essentially, for the Canadian capitalist class, there are two possible approaches that they can take to this situation. One is to go to Washington and work out a deal that is it's going to be harsh, but work out new trading arrangements that are going to that they're going to have to swallow. Ultimately, that's probably the ultimate. That's probably where it's going to go. And Carney may bluster, but in the end, he's going to have to come to terms with the Trump administration, and that's really all there is to it. But if that happens, it means, of course, a very serious drain on profits. If exporting to the United States becomes more costly for Canadian capital, that means a major drain on profits. The alternative strategy, which they're pursuing with great vigor, is to diversify trade as much as possible. And Carney has he's been racking up the air miles since he became prime minister. He's been going all over the world, including China, looking for better deals, annoying the US administration considerably by doing it, making lots of noises about recalibrating the Canadian economy, and he's doing everything he can to diversify trade. I don't believe that can possibly happen on a scale that's going to change fundamentally the shape of the Canadian economy, but he's doing as much as he can. But if he pursues that strategy, the same is true. In order to diversify trade, Canada, with Canadian capitalism, has particularly low GDP. It's not competitive in many, many ways. There's going to have to be a massive intensification of exploitation in order to do that. So the point I'm making is that either way, whichever route they go, or whether they combine it, in the end, the only solution for them is to try to impose the burden of that on the working class. That's fundamentally what they're doing. So Carney has pulled together quite a remarkable political coalition. He now. When he came to power, the Liberal Party seemed to be on its last gasp. Justin Trudeau was massively unpopular. The polls were suggesting that the next election would actually lead to a situation where the Liberal Party could actually lose its standing as a parliamentary party. So they were on the verge of complete disaster. In comes Carney with a plan, and he absolutely won the confidence of all of the major organizations of the capitalist class, the business lobby groups and all the rest of it, and pulled together a consensus amongst all of the pillars of the Canadian establishment. Before this happened, it looked as if we were going to have a far-right Conservative Party under a leader who had taken the party enormously to the right. Pierre Poilievre looked like they were on the verge of taking power. Today, that's not the situation at all. Poilievre looks like he's going to lose the leadership. The Conservative Party is in retreat. And Carney has absolutely won wide support. So much so that just the strength of his political coalition is such that in the last short period, the leader of the deputy leader of the Social Democratic NDP here in Ontario at the provincial level, she resigned from the party so that she could run for the Liberals in a by-election federally, and is now part of Carney's caucus. At the same time as that takes place, there is a Tory MP who represents a riding in southwestern Ontario, who is on the far right fringe of the Conservative Party, absolutely at the dividing line between fascist extremism and the limits of mainstream conservatism. And she just resigned from the Conservatives to join the Liberal caucus. So he's pulling in support from both sides, and as well, the coalition that he's fashioning has lined up the provincial governments and the territorial governments to an incredible degree. Canada, of course, has a federated system of government, so the provincial governments have very, very significant powers. The measures that are being implemented at the federal level are therefore being complemented by the same approach at the provincial level and the municipal level. So an absolute, not an absolute, but very close to an absolute political consensus behind Carney at the moment. That's the great strength that he brings into this situation. And I don't think that could be emphasized enough, that there are no immediate prospects for any serious opposition. The Conservatives have been weakened greatly. In the last election, the NDP was just obliterated in terms of its level of parliamentary representation. So Carney is strong in that immediate sense. I'm going to suggest shortly that he's far from invincible, but he is dealing from a position of very formidable political strength at the moment. In terms of the actual agenda that he's pulling together, I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that it's a class war agenda. I mean, he is taking steps that are quite unprecedented in terms of their magnitude. He has, in keeping with the things that the business lobby groups have been calling for years, he's engaging in a massive course of deregulation. And what that means in a federated system, of course, is that a lot of the rules that regard to trade, workers' rights, consumer protection, all those environmental protection, all of those kinds of things often are operating at the provincial level. So his plan is to reduce everything to the lowest common denominator in terms of any measures that would restrain the hand of capital, and he has an amazing political consensus in that regard behind him. He's also going the route of enormous austerity measures, a 15% cut in the federal budget, the layoff of workers for the federal government on an enormous scale, an agenda that's being replicated at the provincial and municipal level at the same time, and huge cuts to social programs, devastating cuts, in fact, that are having a huge impact already and are only going to get worse. At the same time as this austerity package is coming down, a vast, unprecedented, by Canadian standards, completely unprecedented transfer to military spending. For years, US administrations and other NATO partners had condemned Canada for not meeting the target of 2% of GDP going to military spending. Carney has already achieved that, and is now saying that by the middle part of the next decade, it will be 5% of GDP. So an amazing, I mean, I just read an article the other day where military officials themselves were acknowledging that the money was coming at them so fast they didn't know what to do with it. So, I mean, absolutely remarkable transfer over to the military, and at the same time, plans now to form a military auxiliary force that will just recruit people at the local level and have a sort of militarize the economy and militarize Canadian life to a huge degree. So that's unfolding. At the same time, massive cuts to immigration. The tightening of border controls to a huge degree, and as well, at the heart of it is this attempt to intensify fossil fuel extraction and mining to a vast extent. He's organized a conference that he's going to be hosting next year with the objective of raising $1 trillion in investment for fossil fuel projects. That's absolutely devastating in terms of its implications, not only because of the obvious disastrous level of environmental degradation, and Canada is already a massive contributor to the process of global heating and such like. Not only because of that, but because of the impact that this will have on communities. A great deal of it is going to involve pipelines and other such measures, and that's going to put the extraction companies, and it's going to put the Canadian government on a collision course with Indigenous communities. That here is an enormous question. The driving of pipelines through Indigenous territory has been an enormously volatile political issue. And Carney is talking about extending that Taking their lead from him, the other provincial leaders are going down the same road. A process of violation of indigenous rights coupled with environmental degradation on an incredible scale. It is perhaps remarkable. I mean, one might think that this would happen at the hands of a formally apportioned right-wing government, but it's part of Canadian life that it's happening under a Liberal government. The Liberals are perhaps one of the world's leading political chameleons, in that they have an incredible capacity to present themselves with progressive credentials, but take the harshest possible measures. The most Reagan and Thatcher-like period in Canada took place in the 1990s, not under Conservative, but under Liberal governments, who introduced some of the most brutal cuts in the whole of the OECD at that time. So that's unfolding with remarkable speed. I would also just say that that I think that the course that they're on now poses a remarkable challenge for the organisations of the Canadian working class. The trade unions, the social movements are facing a remarkable situation, and we're in the early stages of that. But there is, I think, going to be quite historic battles that are going to lie ahead. The scale and the intensity and the pace of what is being thrown against us is incredible. There have already been skirmishes. There have been some indigenous encampments that have gone up. There's been important fightbacks that have taken place at various levels. But relative to the situation, there is a horrible lack of preparedness. I actually, before I came on, I just had to check the website of the CLC, the Canadian Labour Congress, which would be the equivalent of the TUC, and I was sort of ready to take a critical look at what they were saying about what Carney was doing, and probably I expected that they wouldn't be proposing a course of action that was particularly strong and adequate to the situation. But to my amazement, they don't even mention it. They're not even talking about what is unfolding and what's happening. So a sad lack of preparedness. But at the same time, struggles are breaking out, and they're all really commonly fighting against the whole austerity agenda, and that's of enormous importance. But I think that that we're really now in a situation where we're going to have to work at the base to encourage a level of combativity and resistance that isn't yet there. But I don't know, and I can't predict, and no one, of course, can, where the flashpoints are going to be. But they're already sharply manifesting themselves. At the moment, in Ontario, the Ontario Public Service Employees Union is leading a very large strike of community service workers that's being organised on an incredibly imaginative and important way, escalating tactics, building community-based alliances, calling workers out on strike on an escalating basis, and it's a remarkably hard-hitting and effective kind of measure. Within the federal public sector, there is already considerable emphasis being placed on forming alliances, on fighting back, and we have a situation where one of the federal public sector unions, the Canadian Association of Professional Employees, CAPE, has now a very strong left-wing leadership trying to give a lead in terms of building a common front. So major struggles emerging there. Lots of combativity and possibilities for resistance emerging. And an absolutely explosive question is resistance by Indigenous people. And that's not a small question in Canada. It's an enormous question. In 2020, an attempt to put a pipeline through the territory of the Wet'suwet'en people in British Columbia led to protests all across the country. And when I say protests, I mean disruptive actions, profoundly disruptive actions. The port of Vancouver was blockaded. You had a situation where ships were lined up in the Pacific Ocean. The Mohawks of Tyendinaga in Ontario blocked the main railway line going across the country. There was absolutely an incredible period of resistance, and they had to come to terms with the Wet'suwet'en people. So that element of the thing is going to be incredible. I would, moving to sort of a conclusion, I would say that I think that what we are facing is a situation, what we're facing here is a situation that is comparable to things that are happening in many other countries. We've seen with the America First turn an amazing intensification of what we're up against. We're seeing major attacks, and we've gone through a period of neoliberal austerity that has been harsh, but generally speaking, relatively incremental. But now we're seeing really, really major attacks unfolding, the impacts of which we're living in a period of instability and crisis and class conflict that I think is unlike what we've seen before. And that's certainly my interpretation of the situation that's unfolding here in Canada. We are not going to be able to defeat that by simply putting on a show. We're going to have to organize a movement of great seriousness that's ready to take actions that are very, very powerful. We're going to have to create a level of economic disruption. We're going to have to create a political crisis for them by mobilizing on an enormously serious scale. Canada has perhaps some of the most stultifying labour relations legislation that compartmentalizes workers and prevents them from fighting back in any generalized united way. But there is a real history of that being challenged. In British Columbia in the 1980s, I should go back and say in the 1970s in Quebec, there was a mobilization of defiant action that broke out of those patterns of containment and organized a sweeping movement that was devastating in its impact. It was finally contained and finally defeated, but it showed incredible possibilities. In British Columbia in the 1980s, there was a movement that became known as Operation Solidarity, and it involved illegal, they term them illegal, of course, political strikes, as well as mass community mobilization. Here in Ontario, where I live, there was in the 1990s a movement that became known as the Ontario Days of Action. At the provincial level, the government was elected with a massive program of austerity that was frequently compared to Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And what was organized was a series of city-based general strikes, rotating general strikes in cities all across the province, that ultimately was called off. Ultimately, the reluctance of the trade union leadership to carry it to a conclusion was a deciding factor. But that history is there, those experiences are there, and what we're facing at the moment is something that's completely unprecedented. A few months ago, the workers at Air Canada went on strike, and this was just after Carney had taken power. They went on strike, and the federal government implemented a measure under the federal labor code that is called Section 107. And it gives the federal government the power to order striking workers back to work. But unlike at the provincial level, they have to go to their legislatures and pass legislation. The federal government can just do it by issuing an order. And so they ordered the Air Canada workers back to work. And to their absolute amazement, they refused to go. And it threw them into an absolute crisis. The picket lines stayed up, the strike continued, the law had been defied, they absolutely didn't know what to do. Air Canada itself was terrified of the implications of trying to actually force them back to work. And so they returned to the bargaining table. In my view, the trade union leadership settled for far less than they could have done, and it was the ultimate result was not impressive, but the glimpse was given of that potential power. So there is a vast, I think, reserve of anger that exists in the trade unions and it exists in the communities. I spent 28 years as an organizer with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty here in Toronto, and I'm very aware of the possibilities for community-based mobilization. So I think we are up against an enormous fight. I think the rules of the game have changed. I think we're up against a government that's determined to impose the burden of a completely changed world situation that impacts Canada with special severity, a very, very major attack. It's not going to go away. It is for them not a choice that they're going to give up very easily. It's a strategic priority to impose the burden of this onto the working class population. But I think we're in for a period of really quite major resistance with enormous possibilities. That I hope that it's going to be possible here to make a contribution to building a resistance that is global and that has enormous implications for everyone. So thanks very much.
I'm going to wash my hair in the next 20 minutes. Do with that what you will, people.
I'm glad you held off on that one.
It's over 20 minutes.
Thank you, John. As ever, very coherent, very clear, and a very deep understanding of what's going on in Canada, with lessons obviously littered through it for the rest of us. I see a couple of hands up at the moment. Finn, I give you the chair first time.
Okay, thank you, Jimmy. Thanks, John, for an informative and interesting opening contribution. So I want to ask a couple of questions. First of all, this question of independence of the regions. I read that recently there's an increase in the demand for independence in the province of Alberta. Secessionism is picking up support in that province. I spent made many visits to Calgary over the years, and I know Alberta is a prosperous region, rich in resources such as oil, and it's also the region where there's a lot of resistance at various times that's against, for example, the fracking and stuff of that nature. Plus, and then a new Democratic Party with a big and active membership. There was a similar, probably still there, movement for independence in Quebec, which has lasted quite a long time. I remember de Gaulle's visit to Quebec in the 1970s, where he launched the slogan, Vive le Québec libre, trying to stimulate the movement. And I'm just wondering, is this movement for secession in Alberta, which seems to be quite recent, and the Quebec movement for secession, which goes back a long time, is that going to have an effect? And what do you think, John, the events, how do you think the events will unfold in that regard? A second question relates to the new Democratic Party. I know we've discussed this before. I know you've said before that the NDP is washed up, but I'm not so sure. I think we need to have a closer examination about that. And if it is to be got rid of, or if it does fade out, what will replace it? Because the NDP grew out of a trade union movement, demand, and the co-op movement. So the co-op movement and the trade unions combined to create the NDP. Is it finished? And I want to find out a bit more about what the experience of the comrades has been. Do comrades attend meetings and put resolutions? How do they learn about resolutions? Is there discussion taking place within the NDP or its remnants or its equivalent on issues of political control and power? Because the issue that we have to face all the time is power, the seizure of power by the political movements of the working class. So my question relates to what's happening in the NDP. They have a new leader, a guy called Avi Lewis, I understand, who's putting forward some radical calls. I just saw, if this is a quote, I think, from him. He said, "This country is awash with wealth. And why is that money not being spent to improve the conditions of workers?" So does the election of this new leader, Avi Lewis, represent any change, or is it just more of the same? Another point I want to raise is about the youth struggle. Across the globe, including America, there's a massive growth and interest and support for socialism. Now, we can spend the whole day discussing what they mean and what real socialism is, but nonetheless, the word socialism is appearing quite a lot in public discourse. And we can see the evidence in Mamdani, his election in New York. In fact, Mamdani spoke at a recent meeting yesterday on Zoom in Dublin. And he just said, as you'd expect, some bland stuff about the world needs to be nicer to each other, and if we're all very polite and consistent, then things will improve. Stuff of that nature, which has no real meaning. But nonetheless, his election represents a big movement towards socialist thinking. And a similar process is happening in many countries. Like in France, Jean-Luc Mélenchon is now going to be most likely the candidate, and he's getting the support of younger people. And the revolt of the youth, which we've seen in Southeast Asia, places like Nepal, the Philippines, Indonesia. Now, that must have a reflection in Canada. And I'd like to hear a bit more about that. I think the opposition to the war in Gaza and opposition to the Israeli regime has had a very radicalizing effect right across the globe, particularly among younger people, in the same way that in the 60s, the anti-Vietnam War movement had a huge radicalizing effect on the youth, not just in America, but there were massive marches in Britain and other countries as well, in Germany, against the war. And I think the war in Gaza is having a somewhat similar effect across the globe. I'm wondering, how is that being reflected in Canada? And just a final point, I mean, war is now probably the principal question facing the globe at the present time. The escalation of war, destruction, division, destruction not just of areas and communities and buildings, but massive killings of people in many, many countries. It's not just the Middle East. In Ethiopia, for example, there's lots of people being killed in ethnic war, which has been there for a long, long time, although there was a interim settlement of Eritrea, but it's still a place where many hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. And we see similar movements in other countries. I won't go through them all, but there's lots of countries in Africa where war based on ethnic and tribal divisions is having a devastating effect. So war is a huge issue. And again, I'm just wondering what effect all this is having on Canadian consciousness. And finally, I read recently a poem by Yeats, which I was familiar with, about Innisfree. Innisfree is the title, it's just an island. And he says in the poem, these are his own lines. He said, just looking at it, I shall find some peace there, he said, for peace is dropping slowly. Now, I'm sure when he wrote these lines, he didn't mean as slowly as we're saying it. The calls for peace and the declaration that peace has been achieved, which Trump does every morning when he gets up. Peace is a huge issue as well, and that'll be a big issue again amongst young people, the demand for the end of war and the coming of peace. So I've been interested to hear John's reactions to these questions, and thank you again, John, for a very interesting and very informative and very factually based opening contribution.
Thanks, Finn. One thing I love about Finn's contributions is that they have a very, very wide and broad linkage to the movement, that it's never just spot in and locked in. It's an understanding I really appreciate. Matthew?
All right, thanks, comments. Yeah, and thanks to John for the introduction. It's very comprehensive and tells us something we don't know. I think there's a few questions. I mean, first of all, obviously the Canada was chosen as a convenient place to park, help useful fascists at the end of the Second World War, particularly Ukrainian fascists, but also fascists from other countries, Lithuania, etc., that had been taken by particularly obviously the British and Americans, and they needed somewhere to keep them. So they put them in Canada. So Canada's been quite central to the Ukraine war. And I was wondering, in terms of, and that's been quite important in terms of the operation of the Canadian government and so on. That bits of the Ukrainian community have been central to that government and the prosecution of that war. And the question really is then, is there any movement against that? Secondly, I think following from what was said in terms of the Palestine movement, the Palestine movement has posed some really very fundamental questions, and has interest. I mean, the thing about Palestine movement is it has shown up all of the imperialist politicians as being genocidal maniacs, because all of them support it. All of them have put forward, have carried on. Have supported Israel to the nth degree. Clearly see genocide as being a piece of normal business. It's not exceptional to them. But again, the movement has been quite profound on a global level. Over the last nearly 3 years, it's really horrible it's taken that long. But it's then what the political effect of that is, and how much has it actually broken through in terms of the efforts to label everybody as as anti-Semites, etc., for even questioning Israel, and the effort, obviously the effort to suppress the movement, and what political conclusions people have drawn from that. That experience, which I think is important. I mean, there's been issue in terms of, really, I think there's a general issue globally, and people don't actually understand imperialism, because that's become clear, that there isn't a general understanding of imperialism, and that needs to be really sort of drawn out. The other thing in those terms also, of course, is the role of the union bureaucracy. I mean, the union bureaucracy in Canada obviously had a terrible record in terms of betraying strikes, as you said, in terms of Air Canada, but also the sort of strike in Vancouver port, numerous other strikes, and of course obviously then it's that sort of method, the use of that layer of people, and against the Canadian postal workers, etc. And it's then, is there any sort of coherent opposition to that and the use of that layer, which is quite conscious. It's not accidental, and these people are being used quite clearly, and they understand that role in order to suppress and to hold down and prevent and sabotage the movement of the working class. And the final question I would ask also is what is the state of the revolutionary left? I mean, it's because that would be fundamental. I mean, I think obviously there's bits of the reformists in terms of NDP, but I mean, is there a revolutionary? What is the state of the revolutionary left? Is it what kind of political debate is there in terms of is there any development? Are there new forces coming forward? Because obviously, as you outline, in terms of a real battle, a huge fight to come, in terms of the effort to suppress both the living standards and the democratic rights of the working class, that will be fundamental in terms of the political forces that are able to offer an alternative. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Any other comrades wish to come in at this stage? Okay, while comrades are thinking, I want to throw a question into it. There was mention in the lead off of the question of I get my mind blocked here at the moment. The New Democratic Party, the possibility that they could resurrect themselves and become a vehicle through which the workers could seek and possibly achieve some of the reforms. There's a question that I'd ask John. Given that the head of state in Canada is King Charles of Britain, and his rule is passed on through a governor appointed by Carney or whoever's in power at the time on a 5-year term. My question is, if the government of Canada was under threat from an emergent political leadership that was on the left and getting active support of the left, would there be resistance should the ruling class in Canada decide to use a royal prerogative to vote out a government, as they did in Australia with, I think it was Keating's government? And if they tried that, would they get away with it? Would the workers acknowledge or just resist it and ignore it, as they did earlier in the Airways dispute? I just leave that question with you, John. And if any other comrade wishes to come in at this stage, I'd ask them just to indicate. And if not, we could go back to John to reflect or answer the points that have been raised.
You've certainly given me a bit to work with there, comrades. To try and tackle, give me a shout if I miss anybody here, because I've tried to keep a pretty good list of everything that's been asked. The question is raised of independence movements, and I mean, within a federated system, that can always be an issue, of course. I think it would be really important to differentiate between what's happening in the Western provinces and Quebec. In the West, at the moment, Alberta has been. There's going to be a referendum held. It's not going to be a referendum into independence. It's going to be a referendum into whether there should be a referendum. But the first tentative steps are being made. What you have in Alberta has long had, it has a radical left tradition too, but it also has a very, very right-wing governing structure for most of the time. And a very right-wing administration is in power at the moment, and they're looking to negotiate the best possible terms they can with regards to resource extraction from the federal government. And Carney has been making very conciliatory measures towards them, and he wants to expand the process as well. But they're looking to put maximum pressure on him, and they want to lock it in so that should there be a more left-wing government, they're going to be dealing with a renegotiated confederation under which Alberta has increased powers. So they're trying to pressure. So fundamentally, I think what we're looking at is a very reactionary and vicious move to strengthen oil and gas interests and mining interests in Alberta. And there are certainly real issues in Canada about regional disparities and the enormous undue influence of central Canada. I mean, I live in Ontario, which is one of 10 provinces, and yet it has 40% of the population and 40% of the GDP. So those imbalances are certainly there within Canadian Confederation. But I do think that the measure that's the stuff that's coming out of Alberta is being driven by Albertan capital to an enormous degree. Now, there is, of course, a mood of reactionary rage at the base in society that is also very much at work. The Freedom Convoy that was alluded to, the so-called truckers convoy that came across the country and with disruptive impact, which was the largest far right-led mobilization in Canada since the 1930s, that came out of Alberta. I mean, the key activists, people like Pat King, who you can see a video of him where he talks about, defending the white race, and if we don't act soon, the official languages of Canada will be Mandarin and Hebrew. So you get a sort of sense of the kind of people that were behind the thing. So they're all at work now. They're all at work now in that whole movement to an enormous degree. So it's very dangerous, very reactionary. It's a bit more complicated with Quebec, of course. Quebec came into Canadian Confederation because the New France French colony was defeated, and that population was forcibly incorporated into the British Empire. So there is unquestionably in Quebec there's a French-speaking nation, the Québécois, who I think, from the standpoint of basic rights to self-determination, it's an entirely different situation to the one that's unfolding in Alberta. That's not to say that the Quebec nationalist movement has is a picture of progressive thought. It's moved considerably to the right. The present nationalist movement is not anybody's friend on our side, and at the moment, it seems that that movement is content to exert pressure, gain rights for Quebec, but it's not. There's no serious movement for separation at the moment going on in Quebec. That could happen, but so separatism is part of the political mix in this country, and it flares up to one degree or another at different times. With regards to the NDP, I think that's a really major question, and I really wish I had an equally good answer. But I think it's very, very tentative at the moment, very, very fragile. The NDP, left opposition within the NDP and such like is, in my view, other people might feel differently, but in my view, very, very weak. And the NDP had been absolutely obdurate in trying to continue a right-wing course, operate within the neoliberal consensus, which is an unfortunate thing to do. I mean, we might say whatever we might say about Tony Blair, none of it would be good. His concept of the third way, there was some political space to occupy. But when the NDP insists on cleaving to the political centre, they're up against the Liberal Party, which already had base taken, and so they find themselves devastated. And in the last election, Carney played a very, very clever game in which he didn't come out as the fire-breathing conservative who was following in the footsteps of Thatcher and Reagan. He presented himself as the reasonable, efficient, patriotic, and he was able to create a situation where the NDP was absolutely wiped out. Since then, as has been pointed to, we've had a new federal NDP leader elected, Avi Lewis, who I know well. He's certainly well within the boundaries of left reformism. He's certainly no major political firebrand, but he is carving out left space and talking about different approaches, and that's going to resonate. That's going to resonate to an incredible degree. So I think I agree the possibility of an upsurge within the NDP. I by no means the certainty, not a prediction, but I think it's a real possibility. So I think it has to be taken seriously. How far it will go, Lewis as a political figure, I don't think has an exemplary record of boldness and readiness to swim against the stream. He's also confronting, as he's not a Corbyn, but he's going to confront the same apparatus that is hostile to him within the party. That's going to be a major question. The NDP holds power at the provincial level in British Columbia, and is a significant force in other provinces, and many of the holds power in Manitoba as well, I should say. And the NDP is going to be, the NDP provincial governments are very much locked into the Carney agenda. So there's going to be lots of difficulties, lots of frictions, and lots of possibilities. But could there be a situation where people join the NDP in very large numbers and see it as a vehicle to move forward? I think that's a real possibility. I think it's something. I think we have to keep our finger on the pulse and really look at the possibilities. I don't think this is a time to sort of say we have to abandon the NDP and just simply form a new socialist party. I think there are very, very serious possibilities to be looked at, and I simply at this point don't know, and I don't think anybody does. And with regards to people just raised the question of the impact of socialist ideas and how they're resonating. I think to a remarkable degree. I think there is a real sea change in people. I mean, even the sort of formal opinion surveys where you ask people, particularly younger people, do they think that socialism is a viable way? yeah, I mean, people maybe they don't entirely know what they mean by socialism. That's possible, but people have a notion that there is an alternative to the capitalist status quo, and that's very, very prevalent and very, very common, and it's a major force, and we can't underestimate it. I think we are living in a period when socialist ideas can be put forward with a credibility and an acceptance that is much greater than has been in the past, and you do see sea changes. People mentioned Palestine. The question of Palestine solidarity has been remarkable. The durability and determination to carry on the mobilization in the face of repression and slander and intimidation has been remarkable, and the effect it's had on the population. I mean, right now, I see the major Zionist organizations are really lobbying very hard because of some attacks, horrible attacks, that have taken place on Jewish community in Toronto, are looking to seize legislation that absolutely criminalizes anti-Zionist sentiment and expression and mobilization. And people are up against that. But the majority opinion is horror and disgust at what Israel is and what it's doing, and enormous support for the Palestinians. And that's a big, big factor. I think the suggestion that that's a factor that spills over from the Palestine situation and has an impact generally on political thinking and possibility is absolutely true. Question was raised of the trade union bureaucracy and its role. I don't think, speaking to people in other countries, I could say anything that's going to be particularly surprising. But I do think that what we are up against is a situation where the big breakthrough in Canada in terms of trade union success was the immediate post-war period. It started a little earlier in the United States, but it was after the Second World War that unions achieved real fundamental rights, legal rights, that they hadn't enjoyed before. And it happened as a result of an explosion of trade union struggle. The Windsor 1945 strike, which involved a mass blockade of the plant by the workers, was so explosive that the Attorney General said that insurrection has broken out in Windsor. And out of that came a settlement that worked to some extent. It certainly stabilized capitalism, but it worked in the extent that people got incremental gains in their living standards, and unions were strengthened and such like. But it viciously limited the capacity of workers to engage in solidarity actions, to strike outside the life of their collective agreement, and all those things. So the class struggle was to a huge degree compartmentalized and limited. And that changed the face of the unions. They became much more sort of advocacy organizations than mobilizing institutions. And it had a big effect. It strengthened the hands of a bureaucratic inertia and such like. And that's still very much in place. And I think we've entered a period when, as it were, it's like we're in a boxing match, and the third round comes around and your opponent comes out of the corner carrying a knife. I think you have to recognize that the rules of the game have changed and you've got to fight back accordingly. And that crisis is there for us to a huge, huge degree right here as we organize. We've got to look for ways to break out of that. And the stranglehold of bureaucratic inertia is going to be a formidable obstacle to overcome. And that's probably an international constant. And just finally, the role of King Charles. God bless him and all who sail in him. I would say reference was made to the Canberra coup in the 1970s in Australia, where that was exactly the scenario. The Gough Whitlam government was brought down. I would say, under conditions of extreme class conflict and desperation, anything's possible. They could indeed get Charles. They could prop up Charles and tell him to sign something and bring in a royal edict. I think they'd find that very difficult. I don't think it would resonate. I think there wouldn't be. I think it would outrage people to an incredible degree. It would be a very tough measure for them to try to implement. I don't think there's rampant monarchistic fever here in Canada by a long, long way. And any notion of being ordered by the king or his governor general representative and to bring down a government or something would be a very, very tough thing for them to do. But under conditions of extreme conflict, it's entirely possible. There's so much about the situation that we need to have an orientation, but we need to have a very we need to have a very realistic understanding of what we know and what we don't know.
Okay, John, thank you. Again, I would ask if any other comrade would wish to contribute. Roger?
Yes, first of all, I think, as usual, John has spoken with such clarity and in such comprehensive detail too, that it's left very little for further questioning and discussion. So I would like to raise another sort of dimension, which is the link with the rather large country to your south. Now, as you said, John, the economy is at the moment kind of almost inseparably fused with the economy in the USA, and so much so that Trump was even, at least maybe partly just demagogically, but he was even raising the kind of prospect of annexation or unification, and actually, in other words, swallowing up Canada into an enhanced, expanded USA as part of the whole kind of Donroe doctrine that he was talking about. Now, I'd like to ask really, to what extent there's a consciousness within the Canadian population, and particularly within the Canadian working class and the Canadian youth, how much they're following and how much they feel any kind of almost, you could say, a connection with the tensions and explosive kind of contradictions that are developing within US society itself. We can see the midterm elections are coming up in the USA at the end of the, in 6 months' time or probably less now, if they take place, because the possibility has always been kind of dangled in front of us that maybe Trump might even find some pretext in which to postpone them. But if that happens, then there would be uproar. I think there would be an absolute explosion of rage and protest. But also, I mean, if the midterm elections go ahead, it looks almost certain that Trump would be, if not defeated, would be seriously curtailed in his powers and so on. So there's that. There's the development, obviously, of a left, which has actually been growing over the last decade or so. We saw the big surge of support for Sanders in the 2016 election time, already 10 years ago. I think 13 million people in the end were kind of registered as supporters of Sanders. We've had the election of Mamdani, and I think there's one or two other figures around the country of similar kind of left reformist kind of figures. We've seen the growth of the DSA. Again, I think if I think we've got Comrade Steve from the USA is sort of coming in and out. I think he's just rejoining us now. Perhaps he could tell us more about that. We've got the beginning of an awakening in the trade unions and some some quite serious and significant industrial struggles. You've got the definitely, according to opinion polls and surveys, a big move towards the left among the youth in the USA, and for very understandable reasons. We have the uprising in Minneapolis, which was an absolutely, very, very significant. That it was almost a kind of urban-wide, city-wide uprising against the Trump regime. Almost, I mean, insurrection would be obviously too strong a word, but it would be verging on those kind of dimensions, and that was a movement in solidarity with migrants, so with people who the Trump regime definitely was trying to wedge between that elements in the population and the indigenous, or not indigenous, the native population, if you like, of the USA. With all of that, how much is there a kind of fellow feeling among within the trade unions, within at least a left fringe of the trade unions, and among the youth and so on? How much is there a kind of fellow feeling that they're part of the same movement, and that if there were explosive developments in the USA, and I think we can be very confident that those are coming. What kind of repercussions would that have? And what kind of movement of solidarity and sympathy might there be within Canada?
Okay, Roger. I did notice Steve's hand up earlier. I'm just wondering, does he want to come in again?
Yeah, I can come in. I mean, maybe he can respond to Roger, and then I'll come in.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
So I think that you have to frame what's going on in Canada with the inter-imperialist rivalry that's going on now internationally. I mean, the fact that Trump has attacked Canada, attacked the EC, has created a major fundamental change in Canada's relationship with U.S. capitalism. And this negotiations to renegotiate the USMCA is going to create a new problems for Canada. So one of the things that's happening with Canadian capitalism is a redirection towards Europe and China. They're allowing Chinese cars. I think Chinese are going to build an electric plant, taking over a plant. And whether they allow unions is going to be a good question, because Chinese have fought unions all over the world where they build plants, and in British Columbia, where they had mining operations. So that's one question. I mean, I think that one of the problems with the fight against trade war, which is a product of the world's economic crisis of capitalism, is that in the United States, the union leadership of the UAW and the Teamsters have supported the trade war, despite and Sean Fain calling for, solidarity with workers around the world. He didn't consult with the Canadian unions when he supported Trump on trade war and tariffs. So there is a development in the Teamsters in the United States. There's a left-wing opposition. This guy, Richard Hooker Jr., who's got a slate, he's a black Teamster in Philadelphia, is calling for a class struggle, a labor party, and also he supports an end to the trade war. So that's one issue in the Teamsters. So the other thing is the NDP. I think that the one significant development in relationship to U.S. unions, where we've had a campaign in the United States to break, for the AFL-CIO to break relations with the Histadrut, the Israeli Trade Union Federation, is that there was a fight in the Canadian Labor Congress by the Palestine Labor Movement Solidarity Campaign, and they were for a labor boycott of Israel, but actually they were able to get a resolution passed breaking for the Canadian Labor Congress to break with the Histadrut, which is a big development. And I think that shows that within the Canadian working class, there's growing opposition to the genocide and U.S. imperialism. So I think that's going to have reflection in the union. The major problem, I mean, I think that, what hasn't happened, and this is a political problem, is that there hasn't been a direct relationship and solidarity between U.S. and Canadian unions. In fact, we helped have a small rally at the Port of Oakland against the trade war with Teamsters and longshoremen. That has been the only rally in the United States against the trade war of labor, of union people. And I think that one of the tasks is building political linkage between U.S. and Canadian unions against trade war, against imperialism, and against the attacks on the working class. I agree with Roger that the question of whether or not you have an election is a real question. And MS Now, which is like a left capitalist cable network, is actually saying that Trump is preparing to prevent an election, and he's going to use ICE and private armies, these fascist thugs, to attack immigrants and to disrupt the election. So that's a real danger, and that's going to have a reflection in Canada politically. This development in the United States with fascism. So anyway, I think that there's potential, and I think there are big political problems. Unfortunately, as I said, there's going to be a labor notes conference of 4,700 trade unions in Chicago this coming weekend, and the issue of Canada and trade war is not even an issue at this convention. So that really reflects a kind of a failure to have an internationalist policy of workers right next door. And the same is in Mexico, because the United States is moving to intervene into Mexico using the drug war as a justification for that. So in any event, I think Canadian working class is in a struggle, but I do think the Canadian ruling class is in a weaker position than the United States. And I think that because of, this American imperialism, the last is the NDP. I think that there could be big growth in the NDP. The fact that you have a national left social democratic party in Canada is, significant. I don't think it's a revolutionary socialist party, but people could look to that as this economic crisis grows, which it is going to grow. So anyway, those are my thoughts.
Okay, Steve. Any other comrade yet considering their ideas or wish to raise any questions? No. Right, we go back to you, John. So,
okay, and I'm sorry, somebody previously had asked about revolutionary left, and I just missed that point. But just to say that I mean, I won't go into sort of like details of groups, but I think that I think the situation is quite weak. I don't think we have, in my estimation, there isn't a sort of there isn't a formation that has influence across the country that's equal to influencing the course of events at the moment in a way that needs urgently to happen. So I do think there is going to have to be a level of cooperation, a level of sort of like common front politics that's going to have to be part of the way that we proceed at the moment. With regards to sort of the situation in terms of links to the United States and thinking here, well, I think there's something important to sort of stress. I mean, there's no question that the United States is the dominant power. I mean, that's true of the United States versus just about anybody else, and it's certainly true of the United States versus Canada. But I do think while Canada is the weaker partner and in this trade crisis situation is acting under unfavorable terms, I do think it's important to stress that Canada is not Venezuela, right? I mean, that sort of, there is a strain of Canadian nationalism that sort of argues that Canada is simply a colony of the United States. And I think it's important to stress that that's not the case. That Canada is, albeit it's in a very bad position at the moment and positioned in a very unfortunate place, Canada is a country that is a global predator, that is an imperialist power, that is part of the G7, that has very definite capitalist class with its own investments, including massive investments in the United States. That we're not dealing with a situation of colonial subordination. Having said that, I think unquestionably an aggressive attempt to impose harsher terms on Canada. The United States capital is the is clearly dominant, and it's going to be able to do that to an enormous degree, which is why I argued earlier that the whole strategy of the Carney regime is to impose the burden of that on onto the Canadian working class. I would say that that there is not nearly enough recognition here of the importance of solidarity with and joint action and coordinated action with the US working class. It's an absolutely vital question. I mean, the industrial unions emerged here as a project that spanned the borders in a very, very positive and important way. And there is a kind of a sort of an unfortunate smug element to some Canadian nationalism that sort of has this notion that, you know, the United States is just this backward place where nobody fights back and they all vote for Donald Trump, and we're much more enlightened and militant. And, you know, I mean, look at Minneapolis. I mean, come on, there's nothing like that being replicated here. I mean, there's an explosive situation in the United States, the basis for massive resistance in all the things that have been pointed out, whether it's a flashpoint over an attempt to cancel the midterms or whatever. I mean, there have already been very major struggles, and a huge conflict is underway of enormous importance. It has great bearing on Canada, and the possibility of uniting struggles across the border is an absolutely vital consideration. So, I mean, I don't have a lot of patience for Canadian nationalist, particularly left Canadian nationalism. I confess I've been a failed patriot in two countries, but that's something that I think we have to pay an enormous amount of attention to, and look at doing it concretely, forging those kinds of links. And I mean, it's absolutely right. The example is given of the CLC under enormous pressure, withdrawing support for the Israeli so-called trade union body. That's an example of the ways in which these things go across the border. They go across the border, and they should go across the border, and there should be a much more coordinated attempt to build a united movement, I think. Yeah, I think that covers those questions, unless I missed anything.
Okay, John. John, there's one question that I just wanted to try and get clarity on. Before the meeting, I was scouring, looking for facts on Canada. And one of the things in the replacement of the CIA fact book, there was a statistic in there that said that migration to Canada is less than the average death rate by normal causes. Would you have any opinion on that migration is such a small reality that those who magnify it or those who raise it are simply magnifying it to use it and exploit it? But the reality being that the actual numbers going into Canada are less than the natural losses.
Well, there was in recent years, following the pandemic, something of an increase in immigration. It was organised very deliberately. They needed an inflow of labour, but there's been a disastrous right-wing backlash against that that's had an enormous impact. I mean, opinion polls on this subject are really awful, and sort of an incredible attempt to suggest that all problems flow from immigration. Housing difficulties, it's the immigrants. So it's become a major question here. I mean, immigration is a significant part of Canada's life. I mean, large scale immigration has continued, meeting needs that are actually there, but there is at the moment a really ugly backlash. Already under Trudeau, they massively curtailed immigration, and Carney is taking it further. So they are reducing it to a trickle. And funnily enough, the housing crisis hasn't gone away.
Okay, John. If there are no more comrades which come in or raise any final questions, I would like to say on behalf of the meeting that I thank John for his attendance and for the contribution that we have no excuses for not being better aware of the situation in Canada and its relationship with the rest of the world. I thank you, John, and I hope that we will see you again. And I would ask you quite seriously, as I've asked before, we're here every Sunday, and you are more than welcome to come and join us, irrespective of what the topic is.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Okay, thanks, John.
Cheers.
Now, with that, I will hand back over to Roger and let him update us on future plans.
Right. Of course, first of all, I'd like to echo what you said, Jimmy, that John, you would make an enormously helpful contribution to our discussions on a whole range of issues. So please keep in mind the invitation that we extend to you whenever you feel able to participate. Next week, we are going to have a discussion on the rise of the far right. There's been a growth of the far right, and even a number of places where the far right have entered governments or actually dominate the governments throughout the world, in Asia, in Europe especially, and obviously in the USA. And it poses a question which is often discussed, and we really need more further examination. To what extent does this represent a serious historical retreat or even defeat for the working class movement? To what extent could it be an occasion to actually whip up resistance and act in order to actually mobilize resistance to an extent that we haven't seen for decades so far in most of these countries? What are they? To what, in other words, to what extent are they a threat? To what extent are they a mortal threat, a lethal threat? Those are the kind of questions. And look, all of us are experiencing in different countries and to a different extent, but we're all actually encountering the same issues. So what I would like to do is to encourage comrades from in every country to prepare and to talk for, even whether it's for just 5 minutes or a little longer, about the how they assess the threat posed by these far right parties and where they're already in government by these far right governments. So that's the discussion next week. Also, we have an interesting discussion the following week. Somebody who is an expert on the extent of slavery, modern slavery, including in the advanced capitalist countries, something which, again, not enough attention has been given to, and that's the following week. And I'd also like to give notice that in the weeks following that, we intend to discuss the documents that we're proposing to be adopted by WIN as kind of policy statements. We've got provisional documents have been prepared on really on world perspectives, on the developments within the trade unions, and on the prospects for developing a new international workers' movement. And we also we want to return to something that we already tried to work out a few years ago about a manifesto expressing the objectives of WIN. So all of those are coming. Notices will be sent out in the next few days, setting out our timetable for all of these things. We do really want as many comrades as possible to participate and to contribute to all of these discussions. So next week is on the far right, and you're all invited. Thanks, comrades.
Okay, comrades, with that, as Finn would say, slán go léir a cardja. which
See
is
you now.
good health to you all, comrades. See you next week.
Bye, comrades. Bye.